we can think of Open Campus effectively like a layer 2 for education. Other people can now leverage the platform to create revenue, to create learning opportunities, to make content. There's liquidity in the tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars a day as an industry that you can leverage from, right? That's what's powerful about Web3, because it introduces these financial systems.
And welcome. My name is Rich Robinson, entrepreneur in residence at Animoca Brands. And today we are talking about Open Campus and EDU. And we have Yatsio, chairman of Animoca Brands. We have Yogav Shelley, CEO of TinyTap, and special guest, council member, Jay Varkey. He's the group executive director and board member of GEMS Education. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you very much, Rich.
Please give us a quick introduction of yourselves. Let's go Yat, Yogav, and then Jay, please.
Sure. My name is Yat. I'm chairman of Animoca Brands. We're a company that's been building in the Web3 space probably for the last 5 or 6 years, which sounds like an eternity in our industry. Today, we have over 450 plus investments in the space, and are also known for, obviously building and operating or owning companies such as Sandbox, and of course our partnership with TinyTap, and sort of what we do with ApeCoin and Open Campus and a whole slew of other things. And it's a great pleasure to be here.
Welcome. Yogav?
Hi, thank you, Rich. For the past decade, I've been the founder and CEO of TinyTap. I'll talk about it in length, but very shortly, TinyTap is a platform for teachers to create the interactive content they want to see in their classroom, and for parents outside the classroom to access that, pay a subscription to access the content, and we share back the revenue back with educators. So basically allowing educators to scale their ideas through technology outside the classroom.
Fantastic. And our guest council member, Jay, please tell us about your good self and GEMS, please.
Thanks very much, Rich. Jay Varkey, I'm a director of Group GEMS Education. We're a third generation family business, which runs private schools, predominantly in the Middle East. Started by my grandfather in 1968 and taken over by my father in 1978. And currently we have over 140,000 children across our platform. But the unique thing about us is that we have schools from as little as $3,000 a year going all the way up to $40,000. So imagine us like the Starwoods in the education space. We cater for all different socioeconomic segments and multiple curricula. So if you have such as IB, British curriculum, American curriculum, local curriculum. So really customize the product for the market. We've been going for nearly 6 decades. And we also have a foundation called the Varkey Foundation, which runs a Global Teacher Prize, where we give $1 million to the best teacher in the world. And this year, it's in its 8th year. So we, again, the premise of this is to kind of build out the teaching capacity globally. There's a shortage of teachers globally. And I think the last number by UNESCO was about 63 million teachers by 2030 in the primary and secondary education section. So we're trying to bring teachers as celebrities and bring them back on the front foot and show how much value they actually derive for children globally.
Fantastic. Wow. 6-decade multi-generational family business in education. That has to be, I've never heard of that before. Fantastic. Doing well and doing good. Thanks for joining. Let's switch gears to Yogav and talk about Open Campus and what it's trying to accomplish in Web3, please.
Yeah, first of all, Jay, incredible, and it's good to be here in such good company. I think we all have the same missions, trying to achieve them in different ways, and now together as one group. So that's really moving. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about TinyTap's mission and how it led to the creation of Open Campus. So TinyTap's mission was always about decentralizing education by focusing on the educator side. So today, most educational systems are very top-down. You'll get government funding and agenda, and the content will be kind of dictated by either market forces, like whatever sells in the market, or whatever the governments want to focus, and everything follows that. And we all know that educators at the bottom are, a lot of the time, end up just serving the content and not being an integral part of the system itself. And so we've created tools, especially when the iPad came out, we've created tools for teachers to create their own interactive games. But just like you create a presentation, you design a few slides, make them interactive, add your voice, have a different types of activities, and boom, you have something that feels and looks and like an educational game, like an educational app, and that can be shared outside the classroom and played everywhere. So that was the origin of TinyTap, and teachers came much before, much earlier than teachers started creating content before we even were able to pay them from revenue share. They've created content because they wanted to see that content in the world. It can be content in their own language. For example, Saudi Arabia and Oman and a lot of countries in the Middle East created content in Arabic because there's not a lot of high quality interactive content in Arabic. Israel is also a very strong country creating content, but really worldwide, everybody would create content about what they care about. And we've been running with that. The company started generating significant revenue around 2018, and we were starting to be able to pay revenue share back with teachers, which was amazing. But one problem remains that teachers are not necessarily also entrepreneurs. So creating the content is only the first step. The next step is actually to get that content out, to get it to people, not just to rely on TinyTap as the platform that will drive traffic to it. And so we looked on how we can help them scale their content, and we thought about the wonders of Web3 on how it has the power to connect communities with creators. And so we came up with something called the Publisher NFT, which kind of we'll talk about it longer, but very shortly, we came up with a way to share the publishing rights over games between people who are interested in seeing those games and that content being created with people who want to create that content. And so we did an experiment in TinyTap. We've sold 12 courses in TinyTap. We've sold the publishing rights to 12 courses on TinyTap. We've sold them on OpenSea on December 2022, and the result was incredible. We sold out, and suddenly those teachers who've created those courses had partners on the other side of the world. They got funding for selling rights in their content, and there was a shared system of incentives. And when we thought about how to scale it outside of TinyTap, we didn't want to just keep it to be a TinyTap utility. We wanted this to be something that everyone can join, like GEMS and like other education company, and any individual with a passion of education can join in and help create this vision of a decentralized education system, where an education system is actually funded, created, and promoted by the community and the market. And that was what gave birth to Open Campus, which was set out as a foundation. We'll talk about it in a second, but really that was the beginning of Open Campus, a protocol that will allow the creation of a decentralized education system that is led by the community itself. That was a little bit long, but it should give the audience at home a little bit of background of how we got to this point.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for sharing your journey. That background is important. Tell us, Yad, about your experience and journey with Open Campus yourself.
Well, I mean, I think mine's sort of the more classic sort of entrepreneurial dad story, right? Which is that, once you have kids, then you send your kids to school and you kind of go, wait a second, actually, the education system isn't quite working for my kid. And it turns out not exactly working for millions of other kids. And suddenly you set out and want to change that. And that's actually how I first got to meet Yogev in sort of this quest of making basically education investments. At the time, my personal investments are about 25 different ed tech companies, many of them who have struggled because it's tough in this space. But it's the macro numbers are interesting, right? Because today it's a $5 trillion space. Something like 140 million babies are born every year. Education is something that we do all the time. It is vitally important, not just to our own self-development, but it's in the national interest, right? It's the biggest threat to the democratic institution is the lack of education, for instance, right? So there's a lot of things about learning and education that are fundamentally really critical and important to society as a whole. And as part of sort of this journey, which included investing in TinyTap to sort of learn about this, we discovered that the perhaps most important thing, and this is why what Jay's doing with GEMS is so impressive as well, is that teachers, which are sort of so vitally important to this entire infrastructure of learning, are actually amongst the poorest paid in the ecosystem. And so this is kind of where we saw the opportunity with Open Campus and Web3, because with the same thing, really, there's no difference between physical property rights or digital property rights. It's about rights. It's about owning something and being able to create capital formation from those rights. Back in the day when one of the reasons why America actually became such a powerhouse for intellectual property is because they were one of the very first countries in the world to really fully execute on the protection of intellectual property rights. That's why you could have, like software industries, and that's why you could have movie industries and all these things develop because they had a respect for property rights. Taking contrast, for instance, China only started to institute actual intellectual property rights in the mid to late 80s. Right. Until then, it was all piracy galore, right? And it was only then when they started to introduce intellectual property rights in China that actually that industry started to evolve. And, China now has become what it is because of the respect for these property rights. So the same thing here. But how do you create property rights in a framework for an ecosystem like that is of teachers and educators, where it's difficult to do so because much of that value of that content might not be worth millions of dollars. It might be worth hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars. And this is kind of where published NFTs were the sort of that first interesting sort of experiment, where something that was worth maybe only $1,000 a year now can have all the same benefits of intellectual property rights protection and royalties and everything around that, but in a single dollar transaction through the sale of an NFT. It also expands the use case of what non-fungible tokens can be beyond sort of art and gaming, which is already quite powerful, but also as a package of all your intellectual property rights, these digital property rights sort of packaged in one form or the other, and opens up markets like, not just sort of markets like the US, for instance, or Europe, where teachers are paid a low amount, but still reasonable sort of size in comparison to something, say, like Venezuela or Philippines, where they make just tens of dollars, for instance, right? So that was kind of the opportunity. So we can think of Open Campus effectively like a layer 2 for education, right? And we can think of it as a platform in where other people can now leverage the platform to create revenue, to create learning opportunities, to make content. It's really, I think, a decentralized app store in a form, but not from a discovery standpoint, but from a platform standpoint. All these people who have EDU tokens are now the ones who can start purchasing content. There's liquidity in the tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars a day as an industry that you can leverage from, right? That's what's powerful about Web3 because it introduces these financial systems and empowers basically the people in that ecosystem. And we hopefully can invite as many companies into it, like the companies that Jay is building and on top of other things.
Fantastic. Well, layer 2 for education. That's the first time I'd heard that. That's really fascinating and inspirational. And I think Web3 will unlock that. And I think it's so exciting that Yogav's cat is just meowing into the ether because he loves it so much. So yeah, based on that, Jay, you come at this from a more real world education experience, literally in your DNA. Tell us how that intersects with this journey on Open Campus, please.
Yeah, great question, Rich. So obviously, we are traditional educators, right? We run brick and mortar schools. Children come, we're supposed to deliver a certain curriculum, and at the end of the day, they pass exams and they go to university. That is our traditional system, and that is what we operate in. But because we've been doing this for quite a few decades now, we've also found that the core curriculum that we are delivering is not really fit for purpose for the children going forward. So we're always having add-ons, whether it be community service, robotics, different sort of Olympiads that are out there. So always try F1 courses where children can learn that little extra, because nowadays a lot of people are getting smarter. Everyone's getting the best grades. So what differentiates children? On top of that, separate from the payment issue, going back to Yat's point regarding it's a 5 trillion industry, that in itself is a huge, huge market. But in the public equities market, you probably only have about 150 billion of public equities that's education related. I think the delta is huge. In healthcare, it's about 6 trillion industry, and you probably have 6 trillion worth of public equities that you can potentially buy into. So I think education now is what healthcare was like 20, 30 years ago. That's one. Separately, with regard to the teachers, the shortage is the biggest concern for us because people aren't coming to the teaching profession. But when we have things and partnerships like a TinyTab, where we're trying to test, where we're piloting programs and content that can be created by our own teachers, quality teachers, that can be exported and given access to globally, that becomes much more powerful. So then teachers come into the system, not only saying that, okay, I can do my traditional 9 to 5 job or whatever it may be, but on top of that, I can actually change lives of many children out in other parts of the world because I can create my own content. And the current system is still a bit archaic because I have to teach a certain type of content. But if I can create content on the fly where I think that's actually much more appropriate for a child who's, let's just say, much more rote learning, for example, his methodology of learning is just memorizing or whatever else it may be, creating content like that versus someone who's probably needs much more hyper personalization, whereby they need to probably see some videos and build out analysis around it and quizzes and stuff. That's how they learn. So giving that power to the teacher to be able to create the content that's catering for these types of students that they see in day out is very, very powerful. So what we're trying to do with TinyTap right now is actually we're focusing on one problem that we have and really trying to see how we can make that better. So one of the things, especially in the Middle East, that we have to do in our schools is that teach Arabic and Islamic studies as part of the curriculum, as mandated by the ministry. But the issue that we're finding is that there's a shortage of teachers and a shortage of content in the market because it's still evolving. So what we're trying to do now with TinyTap is that allowing that platform, say, dear teachers, Arabic teachers, create additional content that we can not only prioritize within our own system, but also export to other markets in the Middle East, for example. And that is kind of what we're trying to do in terms of changing the game on what we would sort of see traditional education, but trying to create teacherpreneurs, if you want to call it that, of a sense of word, making them innovate for themselves. They're a bit more excited and passionate to come to school. And that also creating kind of a wave of new teachers coming into our system and building that ecosystem, right? Ultimately, in brick and mortar space, schools will still need to be there because you're going to probably have two working parents. They need to have a sense of being able to drop their children to school. But however, we believe going forward, the economics of how the school operates will change. Much more online learning, much more flexible, personalized learning, a lot more different courses, not just going to be maths and sciences and so on and so forth. We want them to learn Web3 initiatives. We want them to learn more about not just traditional coding, AI, machine learning. That's become the epitome of everything right now. So we want to be pushing courses that they have that set them apart from other kids around the world as well. So that is the evolvement of our education system, we believe, that's happening in our schools at the moment.
Fantastic. Love to see that, those cutting edge initiatives. And thanks for framing that 40x, 150 billion to 6 trillion. I mean, last time I checked, doctors get paid really, really extraordinarily well. And teachers need to be able to have that same kind of financial security as well, too. So, Please, over to you, Yoga. Please dive deeper.
Yeah, if I may. So, first off, Jay touched on a very important point. And that is not only that teachers are getting paid low salaries, low compensation for the work, that also creates a situation where we're not only losing a lot of people who are not coming who are leaving the profession, but we're also missing out on a lot of people who would be happy spending their life as educators. Like it's one of the best jobs in terms of fulfillment and doing something meaningful with your life, just not something that everyone can afford. So the more you create financial incentives for people to get into the profession, the more great people will get into it. In the US, they have Teach for America, where you have Ivy League students take a year off and go to remote places in the States and teach kids on the ground. And then those kids get access to super quality talent pool that comes and teach them. And I think the ultimate goal is to have that talent pool stay as educators. So part of our mission here is to kind of experiment and test out different financial structures to support education. Like what Jay said, obviously the brick and mortar physical location of a school, I don't have a different vision for that right now. I'm also a dad to a 9-year-old. He's not with me right now. So sometimes you do need that place for them to be. Also, there's the social aspect of it, etc. But it doesn't have to be that it's led by one organization or just funded by the government. It might be funded in different ways. I know that Yat himself also has an experience with running or co-owning a school in Hong Kong. The second point.
Keep going and then dive deeper into keep extending it, Gems and TinyTap. Like after you finish the second point, please.
That's my next point. The project we're doing with Gems, I think that's a really good example for how you can already shift the financial incentives of educational content, for example. So GEMS doesn't necessarily have a team completely available now to do this project with us, but they found like the right people who kind of want to champion the project and get on board. It took some time to get it off the ground, and now we're creating this curriculum for teaching Arabic. We're starting with a few interesting courses, and they waited a while to get super talented teachers. So apparently in Dubai, maybe Jay know about them more than I do, but there are some talents, some even elder teachers who have a very specific expertise in language and how to teach it and how to speak it, even with the accent and the pronunciation, that you don't want to do with anyone else. You want to do with that superstar teacher and get his voice on the content we're creating and everything. So what's happening now is that person is not, and they're probably not going to necessarily understand the concept right away, but they're not just going to go and create the content with us, get a paycheck, and go home. They're going to leave their legacy with us. That's for sure. But also, we're going to make sure they have ownership in the courses we're creating. So I'm not an expert in that, but it reminded me of Michael Jordan, getting the Air Jordan deal, where instead of just sponsoring them, he also got ownership in the shoe itself, and that kind of made him most of his fortune. So that kind of reminded me of what we're doing here. So teachers are now creating the content, they're going home, but then this content might be the best content to learn about Quran or to learn Arabic, and everybody's using it, and that can be a life-changing legacy for generations. So that's what we're trying to do. Give everybody a little bit of stake. And now everybody know how to demand that. And when Rihanna does a beauty company, everybody know how to also demand ownership in the asset itself and not just advertise it, do their job, and move away.
That's fantastic. I love that movie Air, and it was preposterous to give Michael Jordan a share in the shoe. No way, we don't do that. The power is with the shoe company. No, the power is with the superstar, and it took a superstar to unlock that. But now, yes, there's so many people that have, even down to just influencers that have stakes in companies that they help to promote. You look at Ryan Reynolds, how he's a billionaire actor because he's really, and it opened up a floodgate. And of course, the power should be to the creator. So that's an excellent example. Thank you for sharing that.
So Rich, maybe this is perfect. This is the perfect segue to just maybe briefly talk again about sort of what is Web3, right? Because Web3 is the web of ownership. And the whole principle of incentives being aligned between all the participants, because that's the issue that we have, not just in education, but broadly what's happening in the world, and specifically in Web 2, which is, value, money, and power is concentrated really at the top, meaning amongst the shareholders and, I guess the founders and creators of the companies. But the ones who contribute to the network effect, rather the people who are sharing the data, whether this is, educational content as we discuss here, but also all the content that's made on YouTube, or all the content that's made on Instagram, or all the content that's made on TikTok, right? Morsels are being paid out to them, if anything at all, to the content creators for a kind of social sort of, satisfaction that might hit sort of, basically your dopamine, right? And your endorphins, and you go, oh, this is great. I just got 1,000 likes on this one. Let me keep doing that. But the value you receive is really nothing, because they basically created a system that extracts all this value from you, right? And basically, the example here we see in the physical world, with equity, is now with Web3, you can now actually participate in all the networks that you help co-create. And I think what's great about the publisher NFT model is the incentive model isn't just built around the teacher getting value, but it's also around the person who owns that publisher NFT. Because that person who owns a publisher NFT, when he or she sells it, they get revenue for that as well. And also they have an incentive to partner with the teacher to help promote it as well, because they now become co-participants, to promote that product. So it really, really aligns these incentives in a way that only Web3 can do. Some stats, for instance, that are worth mentioning is, and this is why we think, this can revolutionize learning and education in the same way that it has revolutionized already the digital content space, with NFTs. Last year, $24 billion worth of NFTs were sold. That's a big number. But the important number is that 90% of it went to creators and owners of these NFTs. Now, that's what's relevant. In that same year, Spotify only paid out about $7 to $8 billion to its creators. Wow. So it's already, really, really a big difference in number. between sort of what NFTs and digital property rights have given to a much smaller number of users versus what we see with Spotify. Now, imagine what could happen if you sort of do this in the education space that has, is already essentially a multi-trillion-dollar industry, but you basically distribute value more fairly across the contributors, across the ecosystem. That's one. You actually create new industries emerging from it, because if a teacher, like as Yogev has sort of witnessed with TinyTap, the teacher who made literally a year and a half's worth of their sort of salary through the sale of this NFT started to hire their friends or bring in some other partners and started building businesses around it because it was worth doing so, and then actually created an even larger industry, as we have seen in all other forms of industry where capital formation became possible because of property rights.
That's beautiful. I've heard Web 1 is more around platforms, and Web 2 maybe apps, but Web 3 down to the creator. But that story gets short shrift that it's already multiples of Spotify, the NFT market, and that needs to be shouted from the rooftop. So I hear about this EDU, native token and publisher NFTs. Could you talk us through that a little bit more, Yogev, and some of the roles in Open Campus, please?
Yeah, I'd love to. So it's a relatively new token that was launched on April 28 via Binance Launchpad. For those of you who are not familiar, Binance Launchpad is a Binance program where they actually work with teams who want to launch a token. They do a very thorough due diligence, ensures that everything is in place. They take assurances and they kind of signal the market that this is a project that they back and they stand behind. And we were lucky enough to kind of get their green light and work with us to co-launch the EDU token. So first off, I know both me and Yat are very excited about the name itself, like EDU. That's education. Kind of automatically speaks for itself. We're very lucky to have that as a token. And the token was launched by Open Campus, which is an independent foundation. The foundation was co-launched by Animoca Brands, TinyTap, Sandbox, Hooked Protocol, and other companies were co-launchers of the foundation. The EDU token was initially launched on April 28, traded on the Binance exchange. Now you can find it on other exchanges. Anyone who basically has the token outside of Binance, has it in their wallet, is an active member of Open Campus, which means they can participate in voting. They can vote on how money is being used, what kind of projects where the EDU token is supporting. The EDU token total FDV as of now is around $700 million, with about $20 to $30 million in daily trading. And what's beautiful about it, that the foundation itself is really comprised just out of a council of 5 members. 3 of them are here right now. And we'll talk about the role of the members in a second, but it's the members and the token and a mission. So it's a mission in a token. A mission and a token. The mission is to decentralize education. The token's role is to kind of be the financial power that where everybody shares their incentives through to make this a success. So now we have 300,000 people who are token holders. We have a shared incentive to see if the token value finds the right utility, brings impact to the world, and by bringing impact into the world, onboards Web 2 companies as well, and also increases the value of the token. And we can talk about the different utilities in a second. But very shortly, it's the first token that is fully focused on creating a new bottom-up education system that is powered and led by the community itself.
Yeah, keep moving forward around that and peel back the DAO and the community that's associated with that.
Yeah. So when something like Open Campus starts, it's basically the brainchild of a few people, of a few teams, and then the goal is basically to really ensure that it stays a decentralized organization and not governed by the people who started the foundation. The role is kind of over time move along from teams to community managing it, but it doesn't happen on day one. So on day one, we have the council and we have the teams who are building the tech stack, building the brand behind that. If you go to opencampus.xyz, You can see the brand behind the Open Campus. You can see already the different initiatives that Open Campus has launched, like the 10 Million Educators Fund, which we'll talk about in a second. But now that you have those first initiatives, you want to start bringing in the community to be involved. So for example, the first place where we want the community to be involved is that we've created a 10 Million Educators Fund. Even the creation of that fund is something that we want the community to kind of vote and approve. But then people who are proposing, the fund's goal is to support educators on the educator level. So instead of them having to start companies from scratch, educators can come and say, I want to create this specific curriculum that teaches sport in Nepal, and I'm not sure I'm going to get VC money for it, but I have a really incredible system that I want to do that. They can explain about it, submit a proposal, and then get funding up to 100K in funding to bring that into a reality. But the concept is that it's not a donation. They're going to create the content, and then that content is going to be partially owned by the Open Campus Foundation. So when that content generates revenue, some of it goes back into the Open Campus Foundation. But who decides which projects are good or bad and which should get funding or not? And that is the role of the community. So right now, we've set up, you can go to opencampus.xyz, submit your proposal. Last week, a week and a half ago, we were in Philadelphia at the biggest education event for teachers called ISTE. It's the biggest teacher event in the US. We met a lot of great teachers on the ground level, and we introduced the Educators Fund to the world. Every teacher that came to the booth could have submitted an idea that they have, and we've gathered all those hundreds and hundreds of ideas, and now we need to approve and get them into the funnel. But instead of us doing that, we're now setting up a DAO to manage that specific fund. So DAO, Decentralized Autonomous Organization, an organization that basically is going to manage the fund. So figure out the different steps in which proposals can get vet, what kind of funding they can get, how they can get, and vote on the different proposals. So I know that Jay, for example, mentioned the Jay Varkey Foundation, where they award exceptional teachers. So this is an incredible work that is being managed by their team, rightfully so. It's their money, they're managing it, so it needs to kind of serve their agenda. But there is a team on the ground that kind of vets the teachers and does that process. As an experiment, what we're trying to achieve the same impact, but see if that can be done by communities who manage that. Obviously, a lot of challenges to accomplish that, and we can learn a lot from the Varkey Foundation, so we can leave something like the Varkey Foundation for the public, to have them manage a $10 million fund and how to award education. So this is one way of how the community can come and take place. Another way, to be a shorter version this time, another important way that the community who have EDU in the wallet can become publisher NFT owners. So whenever there is an opportunity to buy ownership in educational content, you can do that with EDU. TinyTap is the first adopter of EDU, and we're going to have a massive auction of 1,000 pieces of games on TinyTap, or generating a few $1 million. And people will be able to buy co-ownership. And suddenly, instead of us just being a team of about 30 to 40 people in pushing the message out to the world, we'll have thousands of partners who have an incentive to see that a success. Maybe some of them will crack on how you do distribution in India. Maybe someone can figure out how to take that to Japan. That's what kind of we're counting on saying once people become co-owners. So two nice examples. One is a community managing $10 million fund. The second is individual deciding on which pieces of content to bet on and partner with.
Fantastic, much needed initiative. Tell us about your initiatives, Jay, your foundation and Global Teacher Prize.
So like I mentioned earlier on, Varkey Foundation is a family foundation really focused on teacher capacity building. And one of the biggest issues that we saw was that, how are we going to get more teachers into the system? It is, and as I said, there's a huge shortage. There's about 60 million shortage by 2030 in the primary and secondary sector, where teachers, we're not getting new teachers coming into the system, and that's going to impact students ultimately, and indirectly then the schools and so on and so forth. It's a domino effect. So what are ways in which we can do that? And what we wanted to create a prize that was, quite out there. $1 million is a lot of money for the teachers, but we wanted them to have the prize and be able to do what they want with that money, and be able to create something, whether it's give back to school and so on and so forth. And the first year we launched it, and we wanted to create celebritized teachers, and we wanted celebrities to back it. One of the years we had Hugh Jackman to come and give the prize to the Kenyan award winner. One year we had the prize given by the astronaut from space. So we're trying to celebritize teachers, and these prize winners have been from all around the world, from the US all the way to Kenya. And the last one was one from the US as well. It was a sports teacher, and the year before was a gentleman, was a priest from India. Sorry, and he actually donated half his money to the rest of the top 10 teachers. So you have these phenomenal stories. It's putting them on a pedestal, and through that, they're actually getting other opportunities of showing what they have created, whether it's an application for mathematics, whether it's creating STEM education in rural districts of India for girls, underprivileged girls, or whatever it may be. But they're allowed to voice that. They use our platform to voice what they've done. They start getting called to the UN and talk about what they want from the governments and what they would like to support. So, and this elevating them to another level so they can give the voice. But we are more of a prize-giving foundation rather than a grant-giving foundation. So we don't look at specific projects or anything as such. And that's where things like the Open Campus can help us. And where we can work together. We have a huge database of teachers that have applied to the prize. They've been nominated, they've applied to the prize. And through that process over the last 8 years, every year there's a top 50. And that database are some of the best teachers from around the world, from Peru all the way to Australia. And for them to have an access to something like Open Campus, say, guys, any of your ideas, not just about content, whatever you want to give back to your school, or you want to create something new in robotics or something, whatever it may be. But having that platform to be able to, create those kind of innovative teacherpreneur ideas is phenomenal, because it's so difficult otherwise, right? And it's the ease and simplicity of it to be able to go through that process. And that's really what we want to give our database to Open Campus. Say, this is what we want. This is there for you guys to create and look for innovative projects, and supported by Open Foundation or Open Campus. And those are kind of things that we're trying to do to kind of again, all to do with education and backing teachers, because that's a backbone of every school and kind of every kind of government school that there is out there, and trying to bring them back to the forefront and support them on their ideas, because they're in the front line. They know what they're teaching, whether it's good or bad, what the problems that kids go through, and they understand kind of the difficulties. And there are lots of difficulties around the world where it comes to it, but they still want to come to schools and learn, because that's a safe space in a lot of scenarios. So how do you give them that opportunity to just support their communities in that additional manner?
Phenomenal, as you said. And who doesn't want to get an award from Wolverine? Rockstars giving awards to rock stars. Shout out to Mrs. Kathleen Haddon, the rock star in my life that changed the trajectory of my life as a middle school student.
I think it's really beautiful the way you presented it, that it's not just about the money, it's also giving them the voice, because you're kind of elevating them to a different place. You got $1 million for educator? Okay, I want to hear you. What happened there? So it's kind of repositioning them, their status in the world, so they can reach more people and impact them. It is exciting about the possibility we can do together, and looking forward to start going over that list.
I think one important thing to appreciate is the whole point about Open Campus and the EDU platform is that it's supposed to be essentially this virtuous flywheel, right? Which value is generated from the content that's created, which we see here in these examples, whether it's through TinyTap or content that's made with GEMS, and everything that adds value to the ecosystem. Because by value being created, which is currently being created as well, but it's not being distributed fairly, that value going back into the ecosystem means every other participant in the ecosystem gets to have a share in its growth as well, right? So as we go into this next step, it means that the DAO should be generally held, as in the token should generally be held by its majority, by people who have a vested stake in the future of learning and education, right? This is an important factor, because they're the ones who then get to decide, okay, what gets voted on in terms of, a successful project. Because the person who wants to have a successful project sort of voted on needs to do so from the perspective of also thinking what's best for the network itself, right? It can't just be, I want this project to basically sort of raise all this money because it benefits only me, right? I mean, yes, obviously you want that benefit because you want to fund it, but ultimately, what is this benefit for? This benefit is to sort of generate value to the community that's learning from this content, but at the same time also create value for the people in its network, so it can have a sustainable framework to keep basically funding these new projects that are out there. And that's basically the crux of basically the incentive alignment around Web3, where value is generated. And you see this already in the more established layer ones, like, for instance, the Ethereum network, for instance, is one that just simply sustains itself over time in such a decentralized manner, which is really the role, I guess, for every DAO to ultimately move to, that it's decentralized. It moves in, independent directions. It doesn't really matter what someone is building in Africa, what someone's building in US, what someone's building in Europe, for instance. Each of them contribute to the network effect independently of each other and add value to this incredible network that is now the Ethereum network. And with Open Campus and EDU, it's the same vision, but focused around learning, which is such a huge and important space. And so how do you ensure that governance basically stays sort of solid in this area? It is to make sure that the people who hold the token have a vested interest, which means that they'll always look out for it. So if you're a teacher, for instance, you generally maybe have pedagogy, and you generally have an idea of what should be right for maybe potentially students, and if they're the ones who get to vote, and they're the ones who have a voice, right? Like we see with ApeCoin, for instance, there's a proposal stage. The proposal stage is discussed. Who are the ones discussing? The token holders. The token holders in this case are people who would be maybe educators or people interested in education. Like, for instance, a stakeholder in learning isn't just a teacher. It's a parent who has a child who has needs, for instance. It's actually also the students themselves who can be part of that dialogue, because it creates a real sort of democratic framework in this conversation. I always kind of found it a little awkward, for instance, that in learning, the customer the customer isn't the same person who is the user, because the parent is the customer in many cases, but the user, being the actual sort of student, is often sort of given something, but isn't actually in a position to say, well, actually, is this what I want, or is this something that I need, or is it even relevant for what I'm doing, especially in this age of AI, for instance, right? So so if you can combine basically all these stakeholders together in a conversation around a proposal, then actually we might get into some very fascinating sort of developments. Because, you look at, for instance, the digital space, I mean, again, I don't know that's going to happen on day one, but it would be very, very cool if, the people in the voting process include the students themselves to say, actually, I want this type of project to be funded, because the dialogue doesn't really happen at that level, really. But in a DAO framework, you can, because now power is actually distributed amongst the community, which is a little different, right? Normally, the power vests around those who can spend the money, which is the parents or the institution or the country or whatever organization. But if you actually can now say, hey, actually, 100,000 kids want this, they have a voting block, and they have economic power represented through that, then maybe learning will be directed towards literally sort of student-centric, because it's student-desired. It's kind of interesting, right? Which is basically the whole framework of, sort of a democratic framework, which is what a DAO really, really is. So this to us is about the construction of this. In the beginning, the special council, which includes some of us here, are going to sort of be like gatekeepers. So we don't ourselves make decisions per se, but what we will do is, make sure that the policies or the proposals coming through don't break the law, are relevant and so on. Right. But we really want the community itself to be the ones that give us proposals and give us ideas and empower them to do so. And this, by the way, takes practice. With ApeCoin, it took many, many months before we're at this point where there's like literally, 3 to 5, maybe even more proposals a week that are being voted on, because people had to get used to it. Right. We're not familiar with sort of constant democratic processes because we don't exercise that in real life. But then once you get into that, it's very empowering. It's very powerful.
Yes, and the students, bringing them to the forefront. I've heard of students bringing data to their high school saying, hey, look, as teenagers, we don't wake up until this time, but we have to start school with people who are in kindergarten. Why are we doing that? Just because it's convenient for you guys? Like, let us express ourselves the best way. And they're actually getting some of the schedule flexibility through that. So that's one example that I think we're going to see more of. For yourself, Jay, this is kind of a brave new world, the whole Web3. Like, tell us about, as a council member, how you, add value from your amazing utility belt, the tools there, and then what you're learning as well too.
Sure, yeah. Listen, this is very new for me. I'm learning as it is. I'm trying to learn a lot from you, Kevin, and people like that. So always conversing with them. I think it goes back to kind of access, right? I think one is obviously we have a huge student base. Going back to Yad's point, if you want students to vote, that's an easy. Want to do a mini Kickstarter in our system? That's an easy plugin, right? And kids would love to get involved in things like this. They're much smarter than they used to be. It's evolution, right? They know more. They're information at their fingertips. They want to know more. You just got to let them open the canvas for them. But we're just constrained by curriculum to a certain extent. So it's a lot of additional added hours that you got to do to give them that additional value or insights. Separately, even through the foundation, I think the fact that we've done this prize for 8 years, we built our own algorithm to be able to scrape the proposals of 20,000 teachers. So you have to have some sort of filtration system, and then you narrow it down. So these kind of thought process we can bring into things like Open Campus, and then we actually have a third-party auditor who actually vets the teachers when they get to the last 10, the PwC, and there's a format. So there's a process that we've gone, obviously might be a little bit archaic, and there could be ways in which you can better it and stuff. But we have that rigor that we've done for the last 7 prizes that we've carried on. And those are learnings that we can pass on and that we can kind of share insights to be able to make sure that the Open Campus itself also goes by the same framework, but in a different way to cater to the Web3 community potentially, right? But we've gone through that process to be able to identify the best teacher in the world. I'm sure they can, if we can share our experiences, they can do the same thing to be able to find a great project in Africa or whatever, maybe in the best way possible that fulfills everyone's needs.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's really subjectively and objectively true that students are just getting smarter. They have more access to information, the peer networks, and but I also love that as a very established multi-generational institution that you and your organization are also evolving and embracing new things as well too. I mean, that's hugely inspirational. Tell us about some of the projects that are on deck and coming up for GEMS in the future.
Yeah, sure. My father's an entrepreneur, consummate entrepreneur, as you can imagine. He started as actually a funny enough a school bus driver.
Oh, what?
So
Wow.
So it's fascinating. And that's how he started. And he was a hotelier, and he wanted to create private education for the masses. So we were starting to look at, and one of the first schools he built was in the 80s in Dubai, huge expat community, but very affordable fees, only about $2,000. But these kids go to some of the best universities in the world, and that expanded into how can you create what they create in the hotel industry in the same thing as education, affordable education, as well as kind of the other extreme where parents who want to pay $20,000, $30,000 want status, football tracks, 50-meter swimming pools. But at the other end of the spectrum, kids just want a better education than their parents did so they can get to university. It's very simple from that perspective, but the quality of education is paramount across every price point. But what we have done in the past, let's say 10 years, has always actually been about facilities and so on and so on. We've invested a lot of CapEx into our schools. So we were the first schools to create a planetarium in 2008. We had 3D, the whole design technology about 10 years ago. So we were kind of pushing the boundaries on innovation. Nowadays, we're trying to build that around curriculum. So it's not just about what is taught in the class, but it's all that outside and the extracurricular aspects that come into the child. And that's what's really, really important. We're not a selective school, so any child can come to our school. So we don't believe in taking, let's say, A grade students to A star. We actually want to take C grade students A because it's actually that growth that is more important, for us rather than just the grades. And that's that's been our kind of value system over the last 6 decades. So our innovation has been around kind of building capacity, creating these unique kind of scenarios. We were the first ones to create I've forgotten what it's called. I think it's called the Pepper Robot, we brought it into, brought it into school. How can we build that? So we're always testing and pushing the boundaries. When COVID hit, we had our own platform, so it was very easy for us to switch on and off. So we had our own VLE built in. So we were ahead of the game on that, where a lot of people were still kind of figuring out. We knew what prescriptive online education would need to be able to cater to kids of 3 years old all the way to 18. So we were kind of ready for that kind of shift, and we were lucky from that perspective. So we were ahead of the game. So we have our own backbone in our system, in our education system, so that we don't have to use third-party applications or softwares really to run our schools. So we've been investing in those kind of scenarios, and that's why conversation with such as TinyTap and stuff is quite easy for us. It's just, okay, this is how do we plug it into our system? So that's where we're trying to push the boundaries in the old traditional sense. But ultimately, again, it still comes down to getting quality teachers, making sure they have the best, they're motivated to work, they have the best career pathway, additional professional development. That is kind of the backbone. Once you get that sorted, everything else is actually quite easy.
Quite easy, yes, as you say. So tell us, Shogev, about your vision for that. Thanks for sharing, Jay, for Open Campus. Where's that going to go?
Yeah, it's great building it on what Jay just said, because Jay just presented us with what a good school should be. And people who go and attend to GEMS are very, very lucky to have GEMS as an option for them. It sounds like you're always like ahead of the curve. I would say ahead of a curve when we're comparing to a lot of other schools around the world. But really, you're just on par with how the world around us behaves, like technology and apps and phones and remote. It happens in all places in life. But yet in most schools, they don't adapt so fast. They don't adapt to online education because things kind of work and it's been the same stuff. And, even though it's big budgets, they don't trickle all the way down. I don't know where the budget go, but the reality is that there are a lot of schools who are stuck and not as progressive. Even coding took a lot of time to get to all those schools. And now that they're finally here, how long do we need to wait until AI will get into schools, until financial education? Ask, I think 90% of the people around the globe, like what they're missing in schools, and they'll talk about life skills, getting a mortgage, financial education, work ethics, all those kind of things that you have to study on your own when you taxes, when you graduate. And because they cater to a arcane school system. And so what if different communities who doesn't necessarily have the means and resources that GEMS have will have a different system that they can go to and create the content that they want to? And that's what we're looking for in Open Campus, in how we can empower different communities to create the education that they need. And so we're going to actually start and focus on all around the globe, but really one of the interesting use cases is something we're trying to do in Africa, for example. We're working with a very big organization on a very big partnership that I can't disclose right now, but the idea is how you can go to places where you have unbanked people who don't necessarily have access to traditional banking system, gives them access to EDU, maybe as scholarship, maybe as locked EDU, where you, with blockchain, you can have the power to take currency and say that currency is going to be in this card, and that card is only gives you access. Is going to only give you access to educational service. You can trade it, you can go buy a new car with it, but instead, if GEMS has a facility there, maybe it's in Egypt, it's also North Africa, I don't know, then you can take those credits that you've received, maybe you received them from Open Campus, or maybe it was a philanthropy move, but you can take that and use that to access educational services. And then you have educational money looking for services, and you have services where willing to accept that educational currency, and you're starting to have a flywheel because there is money moving between all participants. And some of the students who are holding those EDU, even if they're still in their scholarship cards, can use that to vote on what kind of content they want to see next year and what kind of initiatives they want to create. So that's one big piece of the puzzle, and how you get EDU to everybody in the system, to the students, to the, like GEMS is like Jay said, it's a traditional bricks and mortar, well-run operation. They have to move carefully in how they adapt this kind of new initiatives. They can support them, of course, but what doors are they opening it in their facility and letting it in. It has to be a real world business incentive to make sense for Jay, for example, to do something even deeper with EDU and Open Campus. And that's kind of the utilities we're thinking about. I'll also add that previously Jay talked about the access that they can help Open Campus, and that is not necessarily just about content project. Like any initiatives that the teachers from the Jay Varkey Foundation, the teachers there are brilliant leaders in education, and they might have different ideas that are not necessarily just content. So that is another big project that we need to tackle on which is the ecosystem fund. So how do you create a fund that supports educational services and ideas that can utilize EDU and the Open Campus protocol? Might be access to bricks and mortar schools in remote places. It might be building a way for philanthropists to decide that the best way for them to invest in education is through a blockchain, because it presents unparalleled transparency for how their money is used. So there are different ideas and needs that only people on the ground will be able to present, and then we need to make sure we're building the right infrastructure to support them.
Love it. Yeah, those incentives really matter. Any final thoughts yet?
Yeah, no, I mean, first, I think you've heard a lot of great things. I mean, I think the exciting thing, this is just the beginning, and obviously this is a start where hopefully, more members are going to be, more conversations. Other special council members actually would love to sort of see, some of the teachers who had their first sort of published NFTs sold, other participants in the network, sort of, and see how sort of Open Campus and EDU has changed their life, and how value is being added to the Open Campus platform. I would sort of, one closing thought I would have, just generally speaking, about sort of what it means to be part of a network, is that when you're part of a network, it's not just how you benefit from it. Obviously, that's one element, right? To say, hey, I can own this. It's great because you think education is going to grow as a market, but it's also about how you can support the network. Right? By owning a stake in a network, you're also supporting it. You're also saying, I want this to happen, right? So if you care about education, if you care about the future of learning, if you care about our children, right? If you care about equity in the space and how to sort of bring up more sort of more education and learning and value to the rest of the world, then I think Open Campus and what EDU is doing is a really, is perhaps one of the most powerful ways to do that. By simply participating in the network, you're basically bringing forward a future forward agenda that is so critical. And that's really the mission of Open Campus, I would say. And we're really grateful for this sort of good start, and hopefully continue to build it out to what it can really become.
Thank you so much. Insanely inspirational. Every time I talk about this topic, I get more and more insights and more excited. Thank you, Yat, Yogev, and Jay. We'll put more information in the show notes, and all the best. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
This podcast is for information purposes only and should not be considered as financial advice. Any opinions provided in this podcast reflect the views of the speakers only.